Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Nicaragua webinar entitled Church and State in Nicaragua, Probing the Relationship. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'll serve as moderator today along with Nan McCurdy, the co-organizer of this webinar series. We're very pleased to hear from two knowledgeable speakers today, followed by questions and answers. I'll introduce our speakers in a few minutes. We want to thank Yoav Elenevsky, who is providing our technical support today. And we also thank our many organizational co-sponsors who are being listed now in the chat. Before we begin, we have a few requests and announcements. You'll see several buttons available at the bottom of your screen. One button is for closed captions, CC. Just click if you want to turn that on. Also, feel free to use the chat function to offer comments throughout this event. But if you have a question for the speakers, please don't put your question in the chat or we may not see it. Instead, click the Q&A button and place your question there. After we hear both presentations from the speakers, we'll select your questions from the Q&A to pose to the speakers. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants within the next few days. When it's ready, it will also be posted at nicasolidarity.net and on the YouTube channel of Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. Please mark your calendars for our next Nicaragua webinar to be held on Sunday, December 3rd. The topic will be migration from and back to Nicaragua, along with some comparisons to other countries. If you'd like to become more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing foreign interference there, please join the International Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. You can check the website regularly at nicasolidarity.net. Also, please put your name and email address in the Q&A if you'd like to receive action alerts, the weekly newsletter, and monthly meeting notices. The next meeting of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition is on Monday, November 13th. There's also a campaign underway to oppose coercive measures, also known as sanctions, of the United States and its allies against Nicaragua and across the Americas. The campaign is ongoing, and you can participate in various ways, both virtual and in person, including an advocacy day this coming Thursday, October 26th, in the halls of the U.S. Congress. To sign up for updates and campaign opportunities, go to the link that's being posted now in the chat. You can also get a free lobbying toolkit to help you advocate effectively. We'll post the link for the toolkit in the chat also. To save as much time as possible for this program, we'll enter some other information in the chat about other ways you can get involved or learn more about Nicaragua. And now we turn to our invited speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. James J. Phillips, who is a former Jesuit, who is seeking a better understanding of religious communities, especially how the Jesuits have arrived at their present position in Nicaragua. He has authored 2 books on Honduras in 2015 and 2022, as well as articles about Nicaragua, where he lived for several years during the Contra War and has visited many times since. Jim Phillips, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. And it's good to be here with you all. I wanted to begin, we're going to talk about the relationship between church and state in Nicaragua. And to begin that, I wanted to give some background, really kind of a theoretical background in a sense about the theology and the ideology that underlies a lot of what has been happening in Nicaragua and in other places as well. But and I wanted to start by talking about the traditional church and what it looks like and its relationship to the state, and then talk about liberation theology and how that changed the whole situation. And then talk about what happened to liberation theology, what its enemies did to it and to the revolution. And then we'll end up talking more about the state of the church today in Nicaragua. So the What I'm beginning with here is the imperial, what I call the imperial church, but it's really the traditional Catholic Church. We're talking primarily here about the Catholic Church, which since at least the Middle Ages has been in both partnership and in rivalry with the state powers. So the kings and the popes, the kings and the bishops were always, in the Middle Ages at odds with each other, but also by the time the Spaniards arrived in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, we have a Catholic Church which is very imperial in the sense of expanding, and looking for people to conquer. And you can see that even in the layout of some towns and cities in Latin America, you see the governor's palace on one side of the central square and the cathedral on the other side. This is a signal that the governor's palace and the cathedral, the church and the state, are both working together in terms of the imperial control of Latin America. It's very obvious in the architecture and in many other ways. They're both in both partnerships and also to some extent rivals in power. I want to point out, though, there are basically three things I'd like to mention about this traditional church. It is a church that, first of all, was founded on the concept of divine hierarchy. This is one of the most absolute, central, core, fundamental issues in the traditional Catholic Church, was the concept of a divine hierarchy. God, the rulers, the Pope, the earthly rulers, the elites, men above women, white people above other colored people of color, Christians above non-Christians, et cetera, et cetera. There was a divine hierarchy here. And this hierarchy, the symbolology of it, the iconology was God as a king and ruler in heaven. I mean, many of us who've gone through Christian churches have been familiar with that image of God as a ruler in heaven, the king, etc. And so that was the iconology of this. Now, hierarchy, this kind of hierarchy, the God who will judge the rulers, but we can't judge the rulers because we are part of the hierarchy. The rulers are above us. They are only susceptible to the judgment of God. Ordinary people must obey the rulers. God will take care of the rest. This is kind of the perfect theology for dictatorships and empires. And hierarchy in this sort abhors revolutions. I mean, we have the reason why the Catholic Church has been so conservative, one of the reasons is because of this principle of hierarchy that abhors the idea of revolution, any kind of challenge from below, which is considered a blasphemy in theological terms, against God, against the divine hierarchy. You can see how this whole thing is perfect for dictatorships and imperial rule. Another principle which was very pernicious in the Catholic Church, especially in Latin America, the priority of the soul over the body. We discipline the body to save the soul. Your reward will be in heaven, and anything that justifies, anything is justifiable if it is done to the body in order to save one's soul. Now you can see how this could be misused. And it was in the treatment of indigenous people. We put them, the Spaniards, the Christian Spaniards, put them into slavery often and did terrible things to indigenous people on the principle that they were saving their souls for them. I hope you understand how pernicious this can be, because you can do anything you want to anybody's body as long as you're saving their soul. That can justify all sorts of horrors. And in case you think that this is something from Spanish colonial times, when I was in Nicaragua in the 1980s during the Contra War, I heard from the lips of Bishop Pablo Vega justify the Contra War against the Nicaraguan people on the basis that it was saving the souls of Nicaraguans from communism. And the communism was, of course, the Sandinistas, Sandinismo. So he evoked that principle. And the last part of this is the universal unchanging principles. This theology, this traditional theology is based on the concept that there are universal principles of life, that are unchanging and that we all bow to those universal principles. Next page, please. Next, yeah. Now, liberation theology challenged all of this. When the Vatican Council was called in the 1960s, the bishops of Latin America and other parts of the world came to the Vatican, came to Rome, with their concerns about what was happening to their people, poverty, injustice, oppression. They had seen that. They had seen it through their priests and through their parishioners, and they were concerned about it. And what came out of that, the meeting in Rome, out of those concerns was the beginnings of what we now call liberation theology. And together with that, as part of that, the base Christian communities, comunidades eclesiales de base. And the first early theologians of this liberation theology, a few years after the Vatican II, Gustavo Gutierrez, who really coined, in some sense, the term theology of liberation. Hugo Asman, who was a Brazilian theologian, wrote about the theology for a nomad church, which is the church in which the faith is dynamic. It's not static. It's dynamic. It changes. It is contextual with the people in our daily lives. Our faith is something that evolves and changes with us as we live every day. And one of my the third thing I mentioned there is José Comblain's book, The Church and the National Security State, which is just as relevant today. That book is relevant today as it always was in the 1970s. Comblain wrote about and critiqued the military dictatorships of Argentina, Chile, and Latin America, and the way that national security takes justification over everything else in these states. We see vestiges of this thinking today, both in the United States and in many other parts of the world, where national security is more important than God. It takes the place of God. And anything is justifiable, taking away any justice, any human rights, anything is justifiable in that. That was all challenged by liberation theology. Here are some fundamental points about liberation theology. First, it's a lived reality is a starting point of liberation theology. This begins not with fundamental universal principles, but with where people are living every day in everyday lives. And so the people of Latin America, the people of Nicaragua, the people of Central America, what is the daily life that they live every day? It begins with that. And so much of the theology of liberation is based more on the social sciences instead of philosophy, based on economics, anthropology, history, giving the context for what people live in their daily lives. If any of you are familiar with Paulo Freire's methodology, the pedagogy of the oppressed, it's very similar to that. People look at the reality of their lives and come to grips with that. And that becomes the starting point for everything else, not what the authorities tell them. The critique of imperialism is another part of liberation theology. And with this, the concept of dependency, which they got from economics and to some extent from other social sciences. Dependency is, in their sense, is not the kind of interdependency that we think of, but dependency of people on the religious and political hierarchy. The religious and political leaders tell us what to do and we do it. They tell us how to interpret the Gospels, and that's what it is. They give us reality. We don't have our own reality. And that was what liberation theology was critiquing and saying, no, that is not right. Dependency of some countries over others in the international sphere, well, that's the classic example of imperialism. Dependency destroys human dignity was the message of liberation theology. The base Christian communities that came out of this, and some of you are familiar with this from Solentiname and Ernesto Cardinal's community there. People interpret the Gospels in the light of their own, what gets together in a community, and interpret the Gospels in the light of their own lived reality, not what the bishop told them, not what the Vatican said, but in their own lived reality. You can see how this is an empowering thing that runs right opposite to the traditional church, where the hierarchy tells you what to do. And my favorite part of this, in some ways, is some of the hymns and songs that came out in the Nicaraguan Mass on this illustrate this very well. This is a God, it's a different idea of God. It's not the God in the heavens, it's the God who works and suffers with the people. Our God sweats in the street, changes tires, launders and irons clothes, makes tortillas, sells ice cream in the park. This is the God we have, not the God of the heavens, and that's the God of the elites there. God belongs to the people, not to the religious and political hierarchy. Okay, you can move up a bit. Salvation, liberation is communal, not individual, the other part of liberation theology, which I think is very important. We save each other. We don't save ourselves. It isn't Jesus and me, it's all of us together. Jesus with us, God is with us, and we work with each other. So this is both spiritual and political. We work today for the better world that we want. This is it contradicts the idea of the soul is more important than the body, because material conditions, the society we live in, is integral to who we are as human beings and what God wants in our society. I remember saying from Miguel de Escoto, who used to say, we had to make a revolution in Nicaragua because our people were living in conditions that were not worthy of the dignity of the children of God. So here we have the wedding of a political revolution, political liberation, and spiritual, theological liberation together. You can go to the next one, please. All right, liberation theology and the revolution. Now, the point here is, if we get nothing else here, what I want to say here is that liberation theology and the Nicaraguan Revolution occurred around the same time in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s. And they were very congruent with each other. What I've just mentioned about liberation theology is very congruent with the whole program of Sandinismo. The Sandinista revolution held out the hope for a better society, and liberation theology was exactly that as well. People working for a better society. So there was a congruence between the two. Many Nicaraguans, and maybe some of you who were in Nicaragua during the Contra War, so Nicaraguans saw the similarity, this congruence. And I heard many Nicaraguan people who joined the Sandinistas, the Frente, because of their religious faith. That's what they would tell me. I came to it through my religious faith. The revolution included both liberation theology people and old-time secular leftists. It just included everybody. This is a different kind of revolution where liberation theology for the first time made it possible for people to embrace a revolution, a political revolution that would change their lives. This is not a perfect union. The churches were open, the priests were in the revolutionary government, 3 or 4 priests were in the revolutionary government, Ernesto Fernando Cardenal, the brothers, Miguel de Escoto and others, and other revolutionary or liberation theology priests. I was there during this period, and anyone who was there saw all of that. The church is open, etc. But at the same time, as all of this is going on, and the people are both working in the liberation theology church and also in the revolution, the conservative hierarchy in Nicaragua was critical and often opposed to some of this, with very few exceptions. So liberation as a political and theological reality, this is what we're looking at. The FSLN was seen by some as a vehicle for advancing the sort of society envisioned in liberation theology. I think this is an important point. And to some extent, that may still be true, but that was that was really important to that. We can go on to the next one. I'm going to skip that one for a minute. Now, of course, the religion is used by the empire as a vehicle for spreading empire. It works with the state to spread imperial religion, as I've started to say at the beginning. So when Ronald Reagan came in, of course, religion had to be restored as a vehicle of empire rather than liberation. So we had to destroy liberation theology as we tried to destroy the Nicaraguan Revolution, the both of them together. The Contra-War crackdown on liberation theology. Some of you remember perhaps Reagan's war, propaganda war against both the Sandinistas. And one of the things he explicitly said in the Santa Fe document, if you want to take a look at that, if you may be familiar with this, the Santa Fe document was published by the US government, CIA, under Reagan, and explicitly identified liberation theology as a threat to US interests, not to the Vatican, but to US interests. And the critique was that liberation theology is Marxist because it promotes materialism, it promotes class struggle, it promotes the overthrow of the hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. The pushback to this, of course, came from people like my friend Gary McCohen, whose name is misspelled there, who wrote things like the Christian Socialist Convergence, pointing out exactly that liberation theology and something like the Nicaraguan Revolution are compatible and in fact mutually reinforcing. The Sandinistas are repressing and persecuting religion, and you heard that, I heard that over and over and over again during the Contra War, while I was attending church, while I was watching the 3 or 4 priests in the government, in the revolutionary government, Reagan's propaganda. I point that out because it's the same trope that we hear today against Ortega and the Sandinistas are oppressing religion in Nicaragua. Reagan used the same thing in the 80s, and just remind us of that. The censure and removal of revolutionary and liberation priests by the Vatican and by local bishops. You remember the assassinations, they did it by assassination. Romero, the 6 Jesuits in El Salvador, the churchwomen Guadalupe Carni in Honduras, and others, the removal by censure, the Cardinal brothers and others. And these were replaced, liberation priests were replaced with anti-Sandinista priests in many places, by the local bishops and by the Vatican. And the US aided this by supporting evangelical missionaries and churches who came in preaching traditional religion, the old-time religion, and the US culture to undermine the influence of liberation theology. Next page, please. So by 1990, liberation theology and its advocates were forced into underground by the US, by the United States, by the Vatican, and by the Nicaraguan hierarchy. And in 1990, the same time as the Sandinistas were out of political power. So we have, to me, the parallels here are more than parallels, they are related. The loss of political power and the loss of the liberation theology, I think it's worthwhile to see them together, as 2 parts of the same war on liberation of the people. So my last point for you, I guess, here, I'm kind of going over, I think, is how did the Catholic Church lose its influence among the people today? Today, we've talked about, and those of you who live in Nicaragua have commented on the fact that it seems like a lot of people who were going to Mass, going to church in Catholic churches have abandoned that, no longer do that. I want to point out that this is not simply a result of what happened in 2018 with the involvement of some priests and bishops in the very unpleasant things that happened to people in 2018. This goes back even further. There's a long history of the shortage of priests, or priests not being present, or they're not being available in communities in Latin America and Central America. There's always been a shortage of priests. During the Contra War, some local priests refused to serve communities that were known as revolutionary Sandinista. And I personally saw that in towns like Achuapa in Nicaragua and the local communities around there, which said, the priest doesn't come to see us anymore. He doesn't think we're worthy because we support the revolution, and we support liberation theology. So local communities learned to carry on without priests. The base Christian communities were the beginnings of that, of course. But by the time of the Contra War, there were already many local communities knew how to carry on their religious beliefs and faith without the presence of priests. And over time, and I saw this personally happen, the faith of people began to be expressed increasingly in daily life, in building community, not in rituals, churches, chapels, or priests. So what may have seemed to be the disappearance of an organized institutional religion was actually, in some sense, its internalization. We no longer need the building, the rituals. All of our religion is based on our work in the community, what we do with each other for the people, the betterment of society. I'm not saying that this happened everywhere in Nicaragua to everyone, but this was certainly something that I saw happening in some places. And I think that's part of why people have, all of this is part of why people no longer need the church. It has become, in some sense, irrelevant as an institution, an external institution. Of course, the involvement of the priests in the hierarchy and the violence of 2018 furthered that alienation tremendously. So scroll down, please, just a little bit more. No, I missed it. You can go back. Okay, so the point here is, yes, from absence of priests to the irrelevance of the institution of the church to the alienation of people from the institutional church. This, I think, has been some of the trajectory we've seen in Nicaragua over the past 50 years or so. And I think this is why many people have left the church entirely. Some continue to practice religion in their own quiet way, in their own communities, and many just do not attend church at all. So I think I'll stop there because I'm talking too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I can tell from the reception already from participants that your comments were very much appreciated, and some people have requested that your notes be sent out to everyone. So we'll make sure that happens. Thank you so much. So now we turn to our next speaker, Becca Renk. Becca has been a community development worker for 22 years in Ciudad Sandino, Nicaragua, and she is a delegation coordinator through Casa which is a solidarity project of the Jubilee House community. She's written several articles about the church in Nicaragua based on her experiences and research. Becca, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm just going to ask Barbara, can you confirm for me that we're moving through the slides there?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the topics of church and religion evoke very strong reactions. And I want to recognize that throughout history, many individuals and movements in the Catholic Church have made heroic and important contributions to peace and justice. But the Catholic Church has also been part of the power structure in Nicaragua for more than 500 years. And as such, the church and its hierarchy have often been used to further imperialism and oppress the Nicaraguan people, as Jim was explaining. In recent years, some within the Catholic hierarchy and individuals within the church in Nicaragua have instigated and actively participated in violence, broken Nicaraguan laws, and manipulated the faith of the people for political ends. So I'd like to start today by putting the current situation in historical context. Post-independence from Spain, the church hierarchy and Nicaragua's wealthy elite ran the country together. For practical reasons, for generations, each powerful family had one son who took over the family business and one son who became a priest. In the 20th century, the Catholic, this continued. Jim talked a little bit about the pre-revolution and the 1980s time period. I want to start from post that time when the FSLN lost the elections in 1990. That was when Nicaragua's elite families came back into power and the government-church power relationship was once again solidified. This is talking about the hierarchy as opposed to liberation theology priests. Under the 16 years of neoliberal governments, the church encouraged participation in the democratic process in Nicaragua. This is important because later they made an about face. But in Nicaragua, elections are held on Sunday, and many people attend Mass before going to vote. During the neoliberal rule, priests around the country would use election day Mass to tell people to go vote, and some even would suggest how they might to go vote as well. With the elections in 2006, the Sandinista party formed a broad alliance, which still remains in place today and continues with 14 political parties. Remarkably, this alliance includes even the political parties of former Contras. In fact, Daniel Ortega's running mate was a former Contra leader in 2006. Upon winning the elections and returning to power in 2007, the FSLN alliance formed the Government of Reconciliation and National Unity and explicitly included the church and big business, traditional opponents of the FSLN, in the planning and management of government programs. The FSLN maintained this inclusive tripartite model despite obvious opposition to its government from within the church. As early as the municipal elections in 2008, broadly won by candidates from the FSLN alliance, the Nicaraguan Bishops' Conference claimed electoral fraud, and priests began using their pulpits to encourage parishioners to spoil their votes or abstain from voting. In Nicaraguan elections, once you have voted, your thumb is placed in indelible ink as a measure to prevent people voting more than once. In the most recent presidential elections in 2001, on Election Day Mass, priests openly told the faithful not to vote. One priest held up his thumb and said, "Look, I'm clean, I have no stain." At the Jesuit-run University of Central America, or UCA, faculty and staff were openly told, "We don't want to see any of you with stains on your thumbs." So they were told not to vote, essentially. In 2018, big business and the Catholic Church effectively ended the tripartite governing model when they conspired to overthrow the elected government and use their role in society to try to turn the people against the government. On April 18, 2018, protesters took to the streets ostensibly to protest a Social Security reform, but it quickly became obvious that these protests were not really about Social Security reforms, but rather were an attempt to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Around the country, armed opposition groups set up hundreds of roadblocks which paralyzed the nation and became epicenters of violence. The roadblocks lasted for nearly 3 months. Some 253 people were killed and many more were injured. While opposition sources blame the government for nearly all the deaths, investigations have shown that, in fact, the United States government was funding the violence through the USAID, NED, NRI, all the soft arms of the CIA. Although the U.S. was funding the attempted ousting of Nicaragua's democratically elected Sandinista government, the Catholic Church hierarchy in Nicaragua was instigating it. Some priests actually initiated violence, including in Ciudad Sandino, where I live, where my neighbors saw the parish priest encouraging the burning of the Sandinista party headquarters and the looting of the Social Security offices. The Nicaraguan Bishops' Conference was called in to broker peace talks, but it instead inexplicably stalled the talks for weeks, while priests called for violence from the pulpit and orchestrated violence at roadblocks. At these roadblocks, Sandinista supporters were identified, beaten, raped, tortured, and murdered, with priests watching and sometimes participating in the horrible violence. A video taken in León shows Catholic priest Father Berrios and evangelical pastor Carlos Figueroa present and doing nothing to stop the torture of a young Sandinista, Sander Bonilla Zapata, which included dousing him with gasoline. One of them can be heard saying, "Take a photo, but don't post it." In Masaya, parish priest Harvin Padilla directed the terrorist gang that tortured police officer Gabriel de Jesus Bado Ruiz and set him on fire while he was still alive. Messages to the terrorists were found on Father Padilla's phone, identifying himself and saying, "Hide him even in the bottom of a latrine. Try to get people not to upload the photos and videos to Facebook so we don't have a problem." In Diriamba, a young Sandinista man was tortured for 3 days inside the Basilica of San Sebastian there. He described how he was beaten frequently by Father Cesar Castillo and how snipers shot at Sandinistas from the church tower. When he told his story, the people of Diriamba stormed the church and found weapons stored inside, as well as supplies that had been stolen from a nearby health center. What was the response of the Nicaraguan government to this violence? The National Police began investigating the incidents of violence, and those responsible, including intellectual authors of crimes, were arrested, tried, and convicted. In early 2019, the Government of National Unity and Reconciliation agreed to talks with opposition groups, which were witnessed and accompanied by the papal nuncio, and they lasted for months. In June of 2019, the Nicaraguan government declared a general amnesty, releasing every single person who'd been convicted of crimes related to the events of 2018, including those who had committed torture and murder. In 2018, one of the most prominent and vociferously anti-Sandinista members of the clergy in Nicaragua was Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Managua, Monsignor Silvio Baez. In October of 2018, Baez met with a group of peasants in an attempt to rekindle the violence which had calmed after police removed roadblocks in July. In the recordings of the meeting, which Baez later admitted to, we can hear Monsignor Baez imply that the violent roadblocks were the church's idea, acknowledging that the bishops opposed the government, had alliances with drug traffickers and criminal organizations, and that they were plotting a second wave of violence to get rid of the FSLN. Speaking about President Daniel Ortega, Baez said, "We have every desire to put him in front of the firing squad." So how did the Nicaraguan people respond to this? By rejecting violence and seeking justice. The recordings of this meeting with Monsignor Baez were leaked to a group of Catholics from the Christian-based community, St. Paul the Apostle, one of the groups that Jim was talking about. This group collected 586,000 signatures from Nicaraguans, this in a country of less than 7 million people. And they sent a petition with those signatures to the Vatican to request the removal of Baez for his role in supporting the attempted coup and his continued hate speech and calls for violence. In response, in April 2019, Pope Francis recalled Baez to Rome. After Rome, Baez then went back to Miami and remains close to opposition groups there that continue to plot the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government. For Catholics in Nicaragua, hearing their priests call for violence and seeing them participate in the violence is abhorrent. The Nicaraguan people have remained steadfast in their rejection of violence. I've talked to many Catholics who no longer go to Mass at all because their clergy continue to promote violence and seek political ends from the pulpit. One of the members of the clergy most notorious for this is former Bishop of Matagalpa and Esteli, Rolando Alvarez, who is widely known for his offensive rhetoric and openly calling for violence from the pulpit. People from the town of Chaguatillo in Matagalpa told me about an incident where Alvarez came to give Mass at the church that the people themselves had raised the money for and built with their own hands. During Mass, Alvarez asked who in the congregation was Sandinista. When all the Sandinistas raised their hands, he pointed to the door and said, "Get out of my church." This is reminiscent of the kind of attitudes that Jim was talking about during the 1980s as well. Alvarez had 7 radio stations and 2 television channels in Matagalpa. Those state radio stations and TV channels began receiving U.S. funding earmarked for regime change starting in 2016. Alvarez used his media platform to call for violence and attempt to destabilize the Nicaraguan government. He persisted in this even after 2018, despite the fact that these activities were in clear violation of the law and the status of this media as religious media. In 2022, these radio and television stations were closed for legal violations by Telcor, the entity that regulates telecommunications. In August of 2022, Alvarez was placed under house arrest while being investigated for a series of crimes, including undermining national integrity, promoting hatred and violence via information and communication technologies, aggravated obstruction of state functions, and contempt of authority. In February of this year, the United States sent a plane to Nicaragua to transport 222 prisoners serving sentences for treason, money laundering, and terrorism to the United States. Many of these people were from the wealthy elite of Nicaragua and had received significant sums of money from the United States to fund its coup attempt in 2018 and further destabilization attempts since. And this move was widely seen as the United States bringing its operatives home to Washington. Former Bishop Alvarez, who was under house arrest waiting trial, was originally included in the list of prisoners that the Nicaraguan government agreed to send to the U.S., but he refused to board the plane. Much to his surprise, Alvarez was not brought back to his mansion to continue house arrest, but was sent straight to prison. He was tried and convicted later that week and sentenced to 26 years in prison for his crimes. In recent months, a number of priests and lay people have been taken in for questioning, and several have been arrested in connection with ongoing investigations of money laundering and other illegal activities in several Catholic dioceses. Back in May, police discovered more than $500,000 in cash hidden in bags in buildings belonging to several Catholic dioceses, and subsequent investigations revealed that money had been illegally taken from bank accounts that had been ordered to be frozen, and the funds appeared to be part of a money laundering network in different dioceses. Additionally, there is an ongoing investigation of real estate in the names of bishops and priests who acquired properties and then illegally transferred ownership. Investigation involves tens of thousands of acres around the country. This brings up a lot of questions. Why in the past few months are these priests who have taken a vow of poverty suddenly appearing with such wealth? Italian journalist Fabrizio Cazzari has explained that those 222 prisoners who were sent to the U.S. in February were stripped of their Nicaraguan citizenship, forfeiting their properties and businesses in Nicaragua. Although their assets were frozen, these convicted criminals managed to illegally transfer money and properties to friendly priests to be later exported to their foreign accounts. Nicaraguan police are continuing to investigate these illegal activities. This week, in further efforts of reconciliation, the Nicaraguan government agreed to send 12 Catholic priests processed for a variety of crimes to Rome. These included a priest who was convicted for the rape of a 12-year-old girl and another convicted of aggravated assault for beating his partner. To conclude today, I'd like to talk quickly about the recent nationalization of the Jesuit-run Central American University, or UCA. The UCA is one of a number of private universities in Nicaragua to be nationalized over the past few years. Let me explain why. First, private education is not prohibited in Nicaragua. In fact, more than 30 private universities continue to thrive around the country. All educational institutions, however, must comply with regulations to ensure that students are receiving quality education. In the case of universities, most were also set up as nonprofits, so they additionally must comply with laws governing nonprofit organizations. During the neoliberal years, large numbers of universities were set up in Nicaragua. Many of these were called garage universities because they were literally a converted garage made into a university to sell degrees, basically. And they charged fees to students in exchange for very little education, in flagrant violation of both educational and nonprofit regulations. Following thorough investigations over the past 3 years by the National Universities Council, the governing body, some private institutions have had their legal status revoked for failure to comply with minimum educational standards. Others have had their legal status revoked for failure to comply with nonprofit regulations. This was the case of the UCA, which had failed to provide annual financial reports for 3 consecutive years, as well as failure to elect a new board of directors when the previous one expired. In accordance with Nicaraguan law, when a nonprofit has its legal status revoked, its assets are transferred to the Nicaraguan government. It's important to note that none of the universities that have had legal status revoked in Nicaragua have ceased to operate. Rather, the Nicaraguan government has taken over operation of the now public universities without interruption to the studies of current students, all free of charge. Because of this policy, simultaneously with the announcement that the legal status of the UCA had been revoked, the National Universities Council announced the opening of a new public university in its place, the Casimiro Sotelo University. Despite the fact that the former UCA was receiving $16 million annually, fully 1/2 of its budget in subsidies from the Nicaraguan government, The fees that UCA charged its students amounted to nearly $700 per semester, far out of the price range of most Nicaraguan families. In contrast, fees at the new Casimiro Sotelo University will be limited to the standard $5.50 semester registration fee at all public universities. I cannot emphasize enough how popular this decision is with Nicaraguans. In fact, I've yet to speak with anyone here in Nicaragua who's against the nationalization of the now defunct UCA. I've spoken with many parents who are excited for their kids to have the opportunity to apply to study there, to former students who were forced to drop out due to cost and have now been contacted and asked to come back and finish their degrees free of charge, and to parents of current students who are excited to have their children continue receiving an education and not have to continue paying the fees. Today, in conclusion, today in Nicaragua, unfortunately, we have ample evidence that 500 years on, the Catholic Church and many of its clergy are still aligned with imperialism, using their position in Nicaraguan society for political ends, and even participating in illicit and violent acts. The response of the Nicaraguan government has been to bring individuals who have broken the law to justice, to regulate institutions that break the law, and to seek peace and reconciliation at every turn. The response of the Nicaraguan people has also been to seek justice, but to continue practicing their faith on their own terms. Across Nicaragua, the rift between people and the Catholic Church is tangible. Recent polls show that only 37% of Nicaraguans today identify as Catholics, that opposed to more than 50% only a few years ago. Some of these former Catholics are now active in evangelical or Pentecostal Christian churches. Public revivals regularly attract enthusiastic attendance from tens of thousands. So Nicaraguans have not lost their faith. We have vibrant Christian-based communities celebrating Mass without a priest. Even those Catholics who have stopped going to Mass altogether continue to pray at home and take part in religious celebrations outside the church. August is patron saint festival season in Nicaragua. Just a few weeks ago, dozens of Nicaraguan cities and towns celebrated their Catholic saints in festivals supported economically and logistically by municipal governments. In my own village, we celebrated the Virgin of the Nancite. Here's our Sandinista mayor of our city taking an active part in the celebrations. In Nicaragua, not only is there no religious persecution, but the Church of the People is in the street, joyfully celebrating its faith. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Becca and Jim. I'd like to remind everyone that if you want to make a question at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A, and that's where your question should go. Now, for the first question, do you know the percentage of Nicaraguans who are Christian evangelical? And either of you can take that.
I don't know. The last I heard, it was probably somewhere around between 40 and 45%. But I think that might be inflated because I don't know whether they're counting anybody who's not Catholic as evangelical. I don't think they do that. But if that happens, then it's going to be inflated. I don't know really, but it's certainly probably somewhere close to 40% or a little higher, at least in that area now. Yeah.
Once again, I see that people are putting their questions in the chat. Please, please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. Thank you. Barbara?
Okay, so here's another question. The question is asking for the opinion, I think, about liberation theology, whether it needs to be applied and would look different in each group or country that it's practiced in. And a second part of the question is, are there any limitations to liberation theology that you could see or have experienced?
I guess we should start with that. I think, because liberation theology is so much, it emphasizes that theology, that people's spirituality and theology begins with their daily lives and the context that they live in, the historical and cultural, social context that they live in every day. That's where it all begins. That would be different in different places. What's true in Nicaragua is not quite true in Honduras, for example, where I also work. There are some significant similarities, but also some differences. And so the way liberation theology is practiced in these places would vary and change a little bit. In African countries, it's also different there, and it's not just cultural trappings, it's also what the government is doing, what the political forces are up to, that, the liberation theology people have to deal with in their daily lives, that informs their faith. So I would say, yes, I think that would be different in different places, although the basic principles I've been talking about, the basic ideas, would probably be pretty much the same, but applied in different ways there, And the second part of that was, I forgot now.
Hang on a second. I think I've got it. Oh, are there any limitations to liberation theology that you could see or have experienced?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that seriously, I guess. I don't know. I think what happens is that liberation theology itself is evolving. It's an evolving experience for people. I think I mentioned somewhere, and I didn't flesh it out very well, but in some cases, I think people have actually gone beyond the theology, and it may be that now liberation theology itself is just a stepping stone to something more, to something different. What it is, I don't know, in terms of people's faith and belief, whether it's all heading to a much more secularized kind of faith, I don't know where that's going. But I think the question is a good one, because it means, it raises the issue of, is liberation theology itself an evolving step towards something else? And I would think that part of the question there would be how it relates to, how does liberation theology become part of a much larger political liberation of people, in political and economic sense in the world? That to me is the really interesting question. And I think it will have to see how that plays out in different places, But its limitation is that it's Christian. It's based in the Christian church. And, if you're Muslim in the Middle East and you're Palestinian, you want to, and you're looking for your liberation from from this, that, or the other thing, then, your theology is not a Christian theology. It's a different approach. So you probably don't call it liberation theology. It's something else.
So let's have this next question go to Becca. What has happened with the church in Matagalpa? Is it still functioning? If so, are there still priests aligned with Alvarez conducting masses? Becca?
I'm not actually sure about the answer to that question. I know that there are many priests that are still alive, including the ones that I know of here in Ciudad Sandino who instigated violence, who are still saying mass and are still active. There are fewer and fewer priests celebrating mass that are not, allied with the opposition, let's say, to the Nicaraguan government. I'm not sure exactly who's been placed in Matagalpa in the church there.
Barbara?
I was trying to choose the best of these all very good questions. Let's give this one to Jim. Well, it says, does either panelist have any insights into the role of the Jesuits specifically in the violence of 2018 and promoting the anti-Nicaragua narrative since then?
I have to take that one first because I was a former Jesuit. I was a Jesuit for 14 years, and I left the Jesuits on amicable terms. It was a sort of divorce, but it was friendly enough. And I still have a lot of Jesuit friends in Central America and in the States, and I've talked with them. And I've talked to some of them about the whole issue of what's happened to the Jesuits in the past few years, and about the question of UCA, and what happened there. How come back in the 1970s and 80s, we had rectors, Jesuit rectors like Cesar Jerez and people like that, who were very pro-liberation and very open. And now we have a different story entirely. I also have met once or twice the recent rector of UCA, the Jesuit, Father Idiaquez. Met him once when he was a seminarian. But the Jesuits, I guess all I'll point out, I have a whole page on this that I didn't talk about. But I think just the point I want to make is, first of all, the Jesuits are not a monolithic bloc. They present an external, they are people who are united by bonds of brotherhood and certain traditions and certain ideas of faith, etc. But they're very diverse people, all kinds of ways, including politically. And what I think has happened is that the most conservative parts of the Jesuit church, of the Jesuit organization, have been coming to the fore again, partly because the others, the liberation priests and the others, have been so oppressed and so put down. I want to just point out one thing about the Jesuit the Jesuits are known for being educators. That was their primary thing everywhere, pretty much in the world, in large places. Certainly in the United States and in Nicaragua, UCA was one of their biggest, and the high school that they ran were their biggest missions or works. And the Jesuit thing about education has always been, traditionally, we educate the children, the young people, the sons of the elite, the people who control society. We educate them because we want to inculcate into them issues about human rights, about social justice, so that when they become the people who run the society, the elite that runs the society, they will run it a little better, with a little more concern for the poor, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the traditional mission, that education will make society better by training the young to do that. Well, you can see several things that are problematic with that. Now, in hindsight, we certainly see it. Number one, it's elitist because it means, it presumes that the elite will continue to be the ones who will run society. But more important, it also, for the Jesuits who do this, it is dangerous to them in the sense that if you're hobnobbing with the elite all the time, even if you're trying to change them, you may end up, we're human and we're corruptible. We may end up, joining the elite and being, our values, our faith has to tell us that the Jesuit faith says what the spirituality is. You use everything, but don't get attached to anything. Detachment from. So if you're working with the elites and using the wealth of the elites and promoting and doing that, you still are not allowed to. Your faith tells you can't get attached to all of that, but it happens. People do it, and what I think has happened to the Jesuits here, there are a number of things which have changed them, but I think that's one of the things that happened to the Jesuits. Working with the elites, they become identified with the elites and with the interests of the elites, rather than with their broader mission. They've lost track of that. Some Jesuits have. I still know many Jesuits who, were critical of that privately, but they won't say it in public because they're Jesuits and they don't want to criticize fellow Jesuits in public. It's good to be aware of that, if there are those voices. But yeah, I think that the Jesuits in UCA, for example, it seems pretty clear that there was an element that was taken over entirely by and join the elites who are opposed to the revolution. So I don't know if that helps at all, but.
Of course, of course. So this next question is for Becca. It is actually a combination of 3 different questions, but it basically says the same thing. Here in the United States, evangelical Christians are mostly extremely conservative. In Nicaragua, I know that some evangelical dominations there are not right-wing, but I would imagine many are. Do you have more information?
Most of the evangelical Christians in Nicaragua come from the Pentecostal tradition and very direct line from missionary churches in the United States. So they've come from Pentecostal churches that have missions here in Nicaragua. And so they would be forming from the culture of the United States and often the politics of conservative politics of Pentecostal churches in the U.S. as well. So there, I would say that probably the majority of those churches do have a more conservative outlook. Some of those churches don't allow women to wear pants. Some of them don't allow dancing. And I would say in general, 2 issues that tends to be across the board with the evangelical churches, anti-abortion and against homosexuality. Those are tendencies that are clear to see within the evangelical churches in Nicaragua. Not all, but probably the majority.
Thank you.
Here's an interesting question, and I'm going to preface the question by saying that yesterday on the Ben Linder Solidarity School, I heard one speaker talking about how the government is promoting more gender inclusion of different kinds, including trans. And so this question says, does liberation theology help to open a conversation on gender diverse inclusion? So I guess I would add to that, does liberation theology help with that? And is the government also opening a conversation on that? Maybe we could start with Jim, but Becca could also answer that.
I'll start with the liberation theology part, and Becca can talk about the government. I think, it's what I said about liberation theology being anti-hierarchical, was a place to start here in some ways, that it includes men and women, so it's inclusive. And so a part of that is that nothing is alien to God. Everything is, everything is included in this creation we have here. And so it's anti-hierarchical and communitarian. And so just for that reason, it would seem that at least in principle, in general, liberation theology would be much more open and accepting of, or even celebrating of the sexual diversity, as it were, and it seems to me that, the traditional Catholic Church is, the Vatican, I always say, is frightened to death of women in particular, and frightened to death of anything that changes, that deals with sexuality or with gender. The Vatican has a tough time dealing with. The Catholic Church has traditionally always had that, partly because of the divine hierarchy. They put that in place, and women have to stay where they are, and people have to be men or women, and that's it, but that, that is all challenged if you really take liberation theology seriously. So I don't know the outcome of this in practical terms, but it seems to me that there's an opening there that liberation theology is open to.
Becca? Yeah, I'll just add that in this year, the Nicaraguan government released a primer on sexual diversity, which is kind of a little bit of a educational tool, mostly for families of the sexually diverse community, which is what the LGBTQ plus community here calls itself. And it's not so much a primer for that community as it is for their families, a little bit of a position paper as well. Nicaragua has a human rights ombudsman specifically for the LGBTQ plus community. And there are laws to prevent hate crimes. And different Nicaraguan institutions actually have regulations to make sure that people aren't discriminated against based on their being part of the sexually diverse community for whatever that means to them. So there's been huge steps forward to include people. Nicaragua also, the government, in particular, the Human Rights Ombudsman for the sexually diverse community, tries to make the point that Nicaragua is not another country. Nicaragua is Nicaragua, and Nicaragua is going through this process on its own terms, using its own terminology. For example, not using the LGBTQ plus acronym, but talking about the sexually diverse community and trying to be very inclusive. And I'll just give you one small example of this inclusivity. The Ministry of Education actually works together with the sexually diverse community to run a school for people from the sexually diverse community specifically. That is a school to do accelerated classes to get them through high school, recognizing that a lot of folks in the community have been rejected by their families. Some have been kicked out of their homes, and therefore their education has been interrupted. And they do accelerated high school classes for them. All the classes and all the administrators within that school, which is run on Saturdays, are from the sexually diverse community. And they've graduated, I think, around 300 students so far from that program.
And both of you can answer this question, but I thought I'd start with Becca, because Becca and her family lived in Nicaragua during the violence of 2018. And this short question says, how solid is the proof of U.S. involvement and U.S. money, etc., in the 2018, she calls it rebellion?
Extremely solid. There's a number of articles that can be found within the Alliance for Global Justice website, within Nica Notes, and with the Nicaragua Coalition website that show exactly where that funding came from and what it was used for. That's extremely solid evidence that shows not only was this money coming into the country during 2018 and after for destabilization purposes, but it was coming in before that and laying the groundwork. And this was not a rebellion that was brought about by students spontaneously deciding to protest about Social Security issues. This was a coup attempt that was led by and funded by the United States.
I'll just add that it seems to me that that the United States government has been trying to, as we all know, trying to destroy Sandinismo, to destroy the Sandinistas, and to turn back the revolution for a long time. And as part of that, as I mentioned earlier, it also has it needs to have elements of the church, religious elements as part of that whole business. And so you had the funding, some of that money went to church organizations and the church as well, because there's been a concerted effort, from what I can see, to divide, to really extremely divide the Catholic Church and the hierarchy in particular against the revolution and the government. And the U.S. has been pretty successful with some of that. The Nicaraguan people have prevented it from going forward more. But yeah, the people are much more savvy. And so that is why it hasn't totally succeeded.
I will also add that the U.S. government continues to fund these groups. So much of what we're hearing about the Catholic Church and the the kind of opposition line of what's happening here. These stories of repression of religious repression in Nicaragua and even religious persecution is actually coming out of sources that are being funded by the United States. The 222 criminals who were sent to the United States in February, many of them have set up their own nonprofits in the United States and are receiving funding through those nonprofits. And then there's other people who have left the country and are living there and are doing what I'll call quote unquote research into this. And then they're the voices that are continually heard in international media about this repression. So if you follow the trail back from what we're hearing now, it's through sources that are being funded by the United States government.
Okay, so this might be a good segue. Becca was just talking about the relationship between these NGOs now started by people who were shipped to the United States. But another piece of that is a question here, which is what is the role of NGOs in this church corruption and crime? And I think the intent of this question is NGOs in Nicaragua, have there been NGOs in Nicaragua that are connected with the church in this? Becca?
There have been, as I mentioned, the universities that have been nationalized, most of those were also nonprofit organizations. Now, there are a couple universities that set themselves up as for-profit businesses. They don't have to comply with the same laws. They only have to comply with business law. And so they are sallying forth with their private education without painting it as being a nonprofit. But the nonprofit ones, they have had to follow the same nonprofit laws. So yes, those have been involved. Many religious organizations have been shut down for non-compliance with the nonprofit laws. There's a number of nonprofits that are associated with a variety of churches that, for one, were not following the basic tenets of nonprofit law in one way or another, and did lose their status as nonprofits. And some of those were certainly involved in issues. There was not. I want to emphasize that really there was not a law that specifically governed nonprofits in the way that we have one here now. And so it used to be possible to launder money very easily through nonprofits because you can receive donations, and then if you didn't have to account for that, it became very easy. The same thing happens with churches as well. And a lot of those churches and church groups, most of those churches are set up as nonprofits in Nicaragua. So it was very easy to say we got an anonymous donation and here it is. Those laws now exist, and that means that it's much easier for the regulators to follow the trail of the money and see where it came from. And if you're unwilling to say where your funding comes from, that's a red flag to begin with. So the churches and the nonprofits are very linked because in Nicaragua, most churches are set up as nonprofits.
This is just a comment based on things that people asked before, but a poll said that currently 44.3% of people consider themselves Catholic, and 38.1% consider themselves evangelical. So it's really, Catholics have really gone down. Now, this question is specifically for Becca. Becca, you've met with U.S. congressional staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Have they had an open ear to listen to you? What's their response?
I would say that some are. Some have an open ear, and not all do. But I would say that it's definitely worth knocking on those doors to see who can be reached and trying to make those connections. I believe that this coming week on the 26th, we have a lobbying day coming up specifically to lobby against sanctions, further sanctions on Nicaragua. And so I think it's worth talking to all of your representatives, sending letters to your elected representatives and talking about these issues. Many of them don't have personal experience with Nicaragua, but they go with the party line or the majority because they haven't had someone approach them.
You might add the Senate to that too, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. If your senators are, if they're on the Foreign Relations Committee, you might want to talk to them some sense about what's happening here.
Nan, while I'm asking the next question, I wonder if you could post again the links to the toolkit and to the lobbying, the advocacy day. Hope you can manage that. Okay. Here's a question from Cindy Farquhar. I think it's more of a statistical question. She's asking, so if you have, say, 40% of the country being evangelical now, and then you consider that many of them are conservative, can it really be accurate, I think, is the implication that there is such a high approval rate for Daniel Ortega and Sandinismo, which the stats indicate they do. Becca?
Yeah, there's a lot of evangelical Christians who support the Sandinistas or who are Sandinistas. I think that it would, whereas I myself have been in Catholic mass and heard the priests speak about politics and even party politics and give their line of what you should believe and how you should vote. I don't hear the same stories and haven't heard that directly from an evangelical pastor. I think that in general, the evangelical churches in Nicaragua, Jim talked about how the Catholic Church has a lack of priests and the priests are not in the communities. That's very true. In our own community, the local priest has a dozen or so churches that they attend. So they're not on the ground in those communities. The evangelical churches tend to have a lot more pastors, tend to be very involved and they're active in communities. And they do not tend to have the same they do not tend to get involved in the same way in party politics and telling people what to believe and not believe. There's definitely a strong community of Sandinista evangelicals.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. This is just a quick request from George Pock, wondering whether there is possibly a list of liberation theology priests, such as Father Denis Hebert. Is there such a list?
I don't know of one. I don't know if there's such a list. There might be, I just don't know.
Okay. Nan, if you're not ready, I could ask another question.
Go ahead.
Okay. How are people in Nicaragua reacting in general to the situation in Palestine?
I would say that overall, people feel a lot of affinity with Palestine in Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan government has made strong statements for peace. The National Assembly made a strong statement in support of the Palestinian people. And the Nicaragua-Palestine connection goes back a long ways. In fact, many of the Muslims here in Nicaragua are Palestinian descent. So we have a significant Palestinian diaspora here within Nicaragua.
When I read I read both the statement from the Nicaraguan government about what's happening with Hamas and in Gaza and Israel, and I compared it to what the United States, with the State Department, has said about all this, and I'm ashamed of my own government, this U.S. government, because the U.S. government is talking about the geopolitical, about supporting Israel and all of that, and nothing about the victims of this, not really much to say about it. I thought that the statement from the government of Nicaragua was much more balanced and really emphasized the people, the suffering of the people, much more than the geopolitical issues. And the reverse was true in the U.S. So kudos to the government of Nicaragua for that really good statement, I thought.
Barbara, have you asked this last question? Do you see
No.
religious? Okay. So do you see religious power in Nicaragua aligned with mainstream media? I guess in the U.S. starting another campaign against Nicaragua because of the Israel-Palestine situation today? Early 2010s president condemned Israel state action, but nowadays you even see Sandinistas divided supporting Palestine or Israel because of their community church, as well as evangelical groups supporting FSLN within the party. This is a lot like the last question. I don't know, maybe this would be a time to ask Becca and Jim in general if they have something else they'd like to share before we end.
I think that, as we see the information coming out in the media, in the international media about Nicaragua, where, if it's mainstream media, if it's large international media, it's never going to be a balanced story about Nicaragua. So we just need to keep that in mind. But I also think it's important that we keep in mind when we see stories of religious, supposed religious persecution in Nicaragua and so forth, keep in mind that Nicaragua is not somehow a country full of Saint Romeros. The people within the Catholic Church are individuals who've made individual decisions as well. And there are some who've made individual decisions to participate in violence and participate in illicit acts. And so we have very easily an idea of these wonderful, wonderful benevolent priests. But let's remember that there's lots of priests all over the world that have committed crimes, and Nicaragua, for the first time in Nicaragua, priests are not above the law. And that is very important, and it's taken a long time to get here because of the influence of the Catholic Church. So we just need to keep those things in mind when we see what's happening in Nicaragua and know that there's another side to the story.
Yeah, I support that. I mean, everything I've been trying to get my head around this whole divide between, it seemed to be a tremendous divide between the way in which people see what's going on in Nicaragua, the support for the government versus the extreme opposition to the government, and how it is that the same events can occur and people can interpret them so very differently or talk about them so very differently. So but I agree that, what we need to do that Nicaragua is a complex country with a lot of people who, have very different ideas about things, and that we cannot accept, very simplistic, answers to questions about, what's going on in Nicaragua. It's always nuanced. And so I think Becca's right about that. Exactly. I support that.
Okay. Well, thank you to both of our speakers. This was really excellent, I think, today. And there seems to be a lot of appreciation expressed by the participants, the attendees. As we already mentioned, we will share the recording of the webinar, and it seems that we should also share Jim's notes and probably Becca's slideshow too. So we'll send all of that out within the next few days. Thank you to everyone who attended, and we'll say goodbye for now, but do mark your calendars for December 3rd for our next webinar. Thank you.